There are certain stories passed down in low voices that never quite lose their chill. Some are shared beside crackling fireplaces, others in cramped record stores that smell like dust and vinyl, and a few only surface in those quiet moments when a particular song hits harder than it should. Among all of them, one tale stands out. One man whose name hangs in the air like smoke after a storm. His name was Robert Johnson. And once his story reaches you, there's a chance you will never hear music the same way again. Picture this. A dry southern night, the highway dust still clinging to the air, the moon nothing more than a thin blade hanging over two endless roads. At the lonely intersection of Highway 61 and Highway 49, a solitary figure kneels in the dirt. In his hands, there's a battered guitar, the wood worn smooth by restless fingers. According to the legend, that was the night he made a bargain. Not just with destiny, but with something far darker. People said that when he finally stood up again, the boy who had once been laughed off stage now played like something nobody could fully understand. What came out of that guitar wasn't just blues. It was hypnotic, unsettling, strangely seductive, too polished, too powerful, too precise to feel entirely human. But why did so many cling to this story? Why did they repeat it as if it were truth? Because no one had any other explanation for what happened to Robert Johnson. How a poor, scorned boy from the cotton fields seemed to transform almost overnight into the most mysterious genius the blues had ever seen. His songs weren't just songs. They sounded like confessions, like warnings, like messages from the edge of something only he could see. This was never just a story about music. It was about isolation, about the price of wanting something too much, about how one man's obsession gave birth to both greatness and myth. For those who remember lowering a needle onto an old record and hearing Crossroad Blues hiss and crackle through a speaker for the first time, this story still stirs something deep in the chest. So stay with me, because what begins as a whisper in the dark will soon feel like a roar inside your soul. And by the time we reach the end, you may finally understand why the blues were never only about heartbreak. They were about surviving the things no one else believed were real. To follow this story, we have to go back to the boy in the fields and the music he could almost hear in the wind. In the Mississippi Delta, the wind doesn't only blow, it sings. Long before Robert Johnson ever laid his hands on a guitar, he was already listening. As a child, he would sit for hours on the uneven wooden steps of a crooked porch. Eyes half closed, not playing anything, just listening. The rustle of cotton stalks brushing against each other, the creak of wagon wheels dragging across dry earth, the slow breath of trees swaying under the weight of the heat. These were his first instruments, the first scales he ever learned. In 1911, for a poor black child born in the heart of the segregated South, music wasn't a hobby. It was a lifeline, a faint echo of freedom in a world that offered almost none. Robert came into a life already unstable. His mother, Julia Major Dodds, had fled their previous home under silent, unwritten rules designed to keep families like theirs moving, unsettled and unseen. She carried him from town to town, never staying long enough to plant roots. Every time they left, a little more hope seemed to peel away and fall behind them on the road. For young Robert, home was never just a building. Home was sound. The clop of mule hooves at dawn, the shouted calls of field hands at dusk, the low murmur of stories told after dark by people who had seen too much and still managed to sing through their sorrow. When he finally did something almost unheard of for a child in his position attending school, it was still music that set him apart. His teacher would later recall that he wasn't loud or wild like many of the other boys. He watched more than he spoke. But when music floated into the room, something in his face changed. He read poetry, studied rhythm on the page, soaked up melodies after a single hearing. His memory worked like a needle on vinyl, one pass, and the song was already pressed into him. The boy had ears unlike anyone around him. He heard layers and patterns most people never noticed. But then came the part that hurt, because while his ears were extraordinary, his hands hadn't caught up yet. Robert couldn't really play. Not then. His guitar sounded clumsy, the strings slack, the timing off just enough to make people wince. At the juke joints, men would shake their heads, smirk, and say, "That boy ain't got no music in him." A childhood friend later remembered that Robert would sit and keep playing even as people begged him to stop. It wasn't arrogance, it was desperation, as if setting the guitar down meant setting his own soul aside. That need, that stubborn refusal to quit, might have been the only thing that kept him alive. Most boys around him learned a few tunes to kill time. Robert played like he was trying to outrun something, like every wrong note was a step backward toward a life he couldn't bear. While other kids bolted through fields after work, chasing each other in the twilight, he stayed behind with that beaten guitar, trying again and again to catch a sound he could hear in his mind, but not yet bring into the world. His world was hardship and struggle, yes, but it was also rhythm, breath, and melody. From the moans drifting over the fields to the soft humming of exhausted mothers rocking their babies to sleep, Robert soaked up every sound, every small fragment of the South's quiet suffering. It seeped into him, reshaping him from the inside out. He wasn't playing just to be noticed. He was trying to speak some deeper language he didn't yet have words for. His fingers fumbled, but his ears never betrayed him. Somewhere inside, he knew there was something locked away, something waiting for him to find the right key. He wasn't only chasing a better sound, he was chasing a different life. And the only path he could see that might lead out of the fields ran straight through that old guitar. This is where the legend truly begins. Not with a cursed midnight bargain or a figure in the shadows, but with a boy too poor to afford new strings, too proud to give up, sitting in the dust and trying to translate his pain into music. Because long before he ever met anyone at a crossroads, if he did at all, Robert Johnson had already discovered a brutal truth. The world would never hand him music. He would have to bleed for it. And bleed he did. Yet the story doesn't stop there. Just like Robert himself, it vanishes for a while, only to return later with a force no one can fully explain. One day, Robert Johnson was simply there, and then he wasn't. He disappeared without warning, walking off with nothing but his worn guitar and a distant look in his eyes. No farewell, no letter, no plan anyone could name. He just walked away. At first, people shrugged it off. Maybe he'd finally grown tired of being mocked. Maybe the constant laughter had cut too deep. Maybe he'd accepted that music, at least the way he wanted it, simply wasn't meant for him. Some people said he left to find work. Others claimed he was chasing after a woman. Mostly, the South did what it always did with boys like Robert. It forgot. Young dreamers slipped off those dirt roads all the time, swallowed by distance and silence, and the world rarely paused long enough to wonder where they'd gone. Then time passed. A few months, maybe a year, and suddenly he came back. Only this wasn't the same boy who had left. Not even close. When Robert Johnson returned, it was like watching a ghost wear the face of someone you once knew. The frame was familiar, the eyes, the jawline, the quiet way he moved, but something fundamental had shifted. The way he carried his body, his back straighter, his gaze steadier, his presence heavier, made people stare. Whispers followed him the way dust followed wagons. Had he seen something? Been somewhere no one else knew about? According to those who were there, no one had any answers. Robert didn't offer any. He never delivered long stories about where he'd been or who had taught him. If someone asked, he'd just give a small, unsettling smile and say, "I've been listening." The real shock came when he picked up a guitar. In the very same juke joints where people had once begged him to stop playing, Robert now sat down and unleashed something that left the room frozen. The fire, the depth, the command in his playing made people forget how to breathe. His fingers slid over the strings with a speed and certainty that felt almost inhuman, like they belonged to someone or something else. The same guitar that had once sounded like a broken box now cried, soared, snarled, and whispered. It sounded alive. It sounded impossible. A local musician who heard him after his return reportedly said, "That ain't the same, Robert. I don't know who that is, but it ain't him." And maybe that's exactly where the legend started to grow teeth. Because when people can't make sense of what they're seeing, they don't usually stay quiet. They start building stories. The idea spread quickly. Robert Johnson must have met someone or something not of this world. Some people claimed he'd vanished into the woods and found an old blues master who taught him secrets no one else ever learned. Others insisted he'd been training in secret with a mysterious mentor no one in town had ever laid eyes on. Then there were the quieter, darker whispers. According to the rumor, he had gone to the crossroads and met the devil himself. The lack of explanation only poured fuel on the story. He was too good now, too changed, too transformed. No one could accept that a man could learn that much, that fast, without giving up something in return. People started to say he must have traded something precious, that no one got that kind of gift for free. But beneath the superstitions and the fear was something even more unnerving, pure awe. Robert didn't just play music, he made people feel things they had kept buried for years. Grief they'd swallowed, guilt they never spoke aloud, longing they could barely admit to themselves. When he played, time seemed to slow. Jokes died in people's throats. Even the drunkest men sat very still. His music cut straight to the soul. Through all of it he stayed distant. He didn't brag, he didn't explain. He just moved from town to town, stage to stage, leaving behind songs that sounded like they drifted in from another realm and chosen his hands as their doorway. People stopped seeing him as just a man. He became a question, a living riddle that no one was sure they wanted to solve. Because if someone could vanish in disgrace and then return with a gift like that, what had they surrendered to get it? What invisible line had they crossed? The truth is, no one ever saw the moment when Robert turned extraordinary. They only saw the before and then the after. No middle, no visible path, just a gap wide enough to swallow reason whole. And standing right in that gap, guitar in hand, was a man who no longer played to win approval. He played because something inside him had ignited. From that day forward, Robert Johnson would never be seen the same way again. But the whispers were only getting started. Because the night that would change everything, that would carve his legend into the spine of American music, came later. When the roads were empty, when the moon disappeared, when he finally walked out to the crossroads. They say the crossroads wait for the desperate, that when a soul wants something too fiercely, too wildly, the darkness listens. Robert Johnson had come back with a talent that didn't make sense. No one saw him become great. No one watched the transformation happen. Yet there he was, playing like he'd been handed something straight from another world. It didn't feel learned. It felt delivered. And so, the legend took its first real breath. Every myth needs a beginning. For Robert, that beginning lay beneath a black sky along a forgotten road. Somewhere outside Clarksdale, Mississippi, where Highway 61 meets Highway 49 inches, a lonely stretch of worn-out dirt, Robert Johnson walked alone. He'd heard the phrase in passing, the way you hear a rumor and tuck it away, half laughing, half uneasy. If you want to play like the devil himself, you gotta meet him at the crossroads. An older bluesman reportedly joked one night, his voice low, afraid of his own words. To most, it was just talk. To Robert, it sounded like a summons. He had done everything he knew to do. He'd played till his fingers ached and bled. He'd listened to every sound the Delta offered him. He'd chased fragments of melodies that existed only in his mind, never quite able to drag them fully into the real world. Still, the sound he wanted stayed just out of reach. He needed more, something no ordinary teacher, no ordinary man could provide. So one night, he went. The wind changed as he walked. The air grew thick, heavy with the smell of dust and something like ash. The usual chorus of cicadas fell silent. The sky felt lower, pressing down. It was as if the world itself had taken a long, anxious breath. Robert reached the crossroads just before midnight. There were no lamps, no houses in sight. Only two long roads fading into blackness and a stillness that pressed against his ribs. He set his guitar on the ground and lowered himself beside it, head bowed. Not in prayer, exactly, but in surrender. He didn't know what he was waiting for, only that he was. Then he heard it. Footsteps, just one set, just behind him. He turned. A man was standing there. No one saw him arrive. There were no crunching footsteps on gravel, no car lights sweeping over the dirt. He was simply there, as if the dark had decided to take shape, tall, motionless, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low so his face stayed hidden in shadow. a long coat that brushed the ground like drifting fog. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. The stranger extended a hand, quiet, patient. Robert, without speaking, handed him the guitar. His hands shook. The man took the instrument and examined it as if he'd seen 1,000 like it and 1,000 more that never existed. Slowly, with an eerie calm, he began adjusting the tuning pegs. One by one, each turn of his fingers sent a note into the air, louder than it should have been, vibrating through the dirt like a distant signal. Then he played. The sound that followed wasn't just music. It was raw and aching, as if it had been scraped from the bones of the delta itself. It carried the cries from fields under a merciless sun, the groans of backs bent too long, the bitter laughter people used to hide lives that were breaking. It felt older than the blues, older than any song Robert had ever heard. He couldn't move. Each note cut into him, carving its way into his chest and settling there. When the stranger finally finished, the air felt unnatural still, empty of wind, as if the night had stopped to listen. He handed the guitar back, leaned in close, and whispered something into Robert's ear. Whatever he said was too soft for anyone else to hear, and too heavy for Robert to ever forget. Then the man turned away and walked into the darkness. Within a few steps, he was gone. Robert stayed there for a long time, minutes, hours. Time didn't behave normally at that crossroads. It stretched and folded in on itself. Eventually, he looked down at the guitar in his hands and plucked a single string. The note rang out sharp and full, alive in a way it had never been before. He started to play. A riff, a run, a pattern, then a song. The music flowed from him as if it had been waiting just beneath his skin, needing only that moment to break through. His hands moved confidently, not like they were learning, but like they were remembering something they'd already known for years. When daylight finally came, Robert headed back to town. The same people who had once laughed at him had no jokes left. He sat down, played a few notes, and the room fell silent. His guitar sounded like two men playing at once, one hand anchoring a steady rhythm, the other weaving lines that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the earth itself. Someone in the crowd whispered, "That ain't a man playing." They meant it as an expression. They didn't realize how many people would take it literally. From that morning on, the phrase followed him wherever he went. If you want to play like that, you got to meet the man at the crossroads. Robert never directly confirmed the story, never stood up and said, "Yes, this is what I did." But every time he passed that stretch of road again, people noticed he would pause, fingers resting on the strings, head slightly bowed, as if acknowledging something he could never fully walk away from. Whatever truly happened that night was never written down, never captured on film or tape. But its echo would haunt music forever. The boy who had once begged people just to listen had turned into something else entirely, a figure of rumor and dread, a man whose name people said with equal parts admiration and fear. The one who might have sat at a crossroads and made a bargain no one else was brave or desperate enough to make. And the man who had once just wanted to be heard had now become something far more dangerous to forget. He had become a myth the world could no longer silence. Not long after his return from the crossroads, Robert Johnson became the kind of man people stared at carefully, but always from a safe distance. His music had changed, yes, but so had everything else about him. He spoke less. His smiles, when they appeared at all, were faint and short-lived. And when he did talk, there was a softness to his voice, a strange quiet, as if his words were traveling from a place much farther away than the room he was standing in. Beneath all the whispers and myth-building, though, there was something deeply human about what Robert did next. He didn't vanish back into the night. He went looking for someone. That someone was a man named Ike Zimmerman. Zimmerman wasn't a ghost, and he wasn't a devil. But to people watching from outside, he might have seemed like a figure pulled from the same shadows Robert was now walking in. Ike was a seasoned guitarist, respected yet unsettlingly private, who lived on the fringe of town far from the noise, the drunken praise, and the chaos of the juke joints. According to people who heard him, Ike could make a guitar sound like it was crying. Some said he had trained a handful of musicians who later drifted into their own versions of greatness. Others claimed he had techniques no one else dared copy. But no one really knew much about him, and Ike never volunteered more than a few words at a time. Robert sought him out not just for lessons, but for something deeper, something closer to transformation than instruction. And Ike, for reasons he kept to himself, agreed to take him in. Night after night, the two men slipped away from the roads and houses, heading out into the darkness with their guitars in hand. They didn't practice in a parlor, a front room, or even on a porch like most blues players. No, Robert and Ike walked straight into the woods and kept going. Their destination wasn't a stage, it was a graveyard. This wasn't a dare to impress anyone. There was no audience, no applause. It was discipline, almost ritual. Under the cold stare of the moon, they would sit among headstones and unmarked mounds, letting their chords drift into the night air. Some believed, or at least felt, that in a place so close to death, sound traveled differently, cleaner, sharper, stretching farther into the dark. Maybe it echoed more because the silence out there was absolute. Or maybe, as a few uneasy witnesses suggested later, something out in that darkness was listening. Neighbors noticed the pattern. Two figures disappearing into the night, always carrying guitars, always heading toward the same direction. A few curious souls tried to follow them once, thinking they might catch the men drinking, gambling, or getting into trouble. But when those people came back, their faces were pale, their nerves frayed. They didn't return with stories, only warnings. One woman insisted that, from a distance, she had seen Robert's shadowed figure seated across from a tall man in the dark, the moonlight barely outlining them. What rattled her wasn't the sight of two men playing in a graveyard. It was the way one of the silhouettes behaved. She swore that the taller shadow didn't touch the ground at all, hovering just above it, moving without matching any natural light. Was that the truth? Was it fear reshaping what she thought she saw? No one could say for sure. What everyone agreed on, however, was simple. After those nights, Robert's playing changed again. His sound grew sharper, darker, and more hypnotic. The graveyard was no longer just a backdrop. It had become his classroom. The dead, lined up in the earth around him, became his silent, captive audience. In that narrow space between life and loss, between breath and stillness, he found tones he'd been chasing since he was a boy sitting on that crooked porch. He didn't seem afraid, not of the dark, not of the graves, not of the thought that he was playing where others were permanently at rest. Maybe he wasn't afraid because, on some level, he already felt like he belonged to both sides, the living and the lost. Some people said the crossroads had handed him his gift in an instant. Others believed it was those long, echoing nights with Ike Zimmerman, those lessons played under the gaze of tombstones and moonlight, that truly turned Robert Johnson into the legend we talk about today. Because it wasn't only what he played that unsettled people. It was where he played, how he learned, and who was there beside him when he sharpened his skill in the presence of the dead. And whatever he walked away with from those graveyard sessions, the world outside those gates was not prepared to hear it. What Robert Johnson carried back from those graveyard sessions was more than just improved technique. It was something weightier, something that clung to his songs the way southern fog clings to the ground at dawn. His fingers moved differently, now urgent but controlled, as if every note he played had been paid for in advance with pain. What he played wasn't simply blues anymore. It felt like an invocation. Everywhere he performed, people sensed it. They didn't just hear the music, they experienced it. It wrapped around them like a story told halfway, like a message only partly revealed. It was as if there was something riding parallel to the rhythm, an unseen passenger threaded through every chord. Audience members tried to explain it in simple terms. Some said it felt like a sudden chill tightening in the chest. Others described a strange pressure in the air, as though another presence stepped into the room the moment Robert started to play. A few swore that his shadow sometimes stretched too far along the floor, bending and swaying in ways that didn't line up with the light. But if there was anything that truly set Robert apart, it was the songs themselves. Take Crossroad Blues, for example. From the very first breath of his opening line, "I went down to the crossroads, fell down on my knees," the listener isn't just hearing a man sing. They're thrown into a scene where desperation and fragile hope collide. His voice, rough around the edges and trembling with urgency, doesn't sound like it's performing a story. It sounds like it's reliving one. It feels less like a song and more like a confession, A man still haunted by a choice he made somewhere under a sky with no stars. The chords themselves are jagged, jumping between control and near chaos, as if he's wrestling with something just beneath the surface, struggling to keep it from breaking through completely. Some listeners later said they felt the hairs on their arms rise the first time they heard it, not because of the myth they'd been told, but because the sound itself felt like it carried a weight that didn't belong to one man alone. Then there's Me and the Devil Blues. The title alone unsettles people. In it, Robert sings Early This Morning When You Knocked Upon My Door, and his voice does not sound like it's imagining that knock. It sounds like someone who has actually heard it echo through a quiet room. Every word drops heavy, deliberate, with the kind of gravity that can't be faked. You don't get the sense he's acting out a character or playing with an image. You feel like you're listening to someone who has already lived through that moment and walked away marked by it. The guitar doesn't sit politely behind his voice. It stalks his vocals, curling around his phrases like something that won't let him go. And then there's Hellhound on My Trail, arguably the darkest of them all. On that recording, Robert's voice sometimes sounds barely like his own, strained, hoarse, breaking into something closer to a whisper than a song. The lyrics drip with dread. And the blues, fallen down like hail, doesn't feel like a poetic flourish. It lands like a warning. The beat pulses like a heartbeat that's starting to race, beating faster and faster, as if someone is running but already knows they won't get far enough. It's the sound of a man convinced he's being pursued, of someone who knows that whatever is behind him is closing in. Many listeners and researchers later believed this was the closest Robert ever came to telling his story straight. That the hellhound he sang about wasn't just a metaphor, it might have been a debt, a memory, a threat, something that refused to stop chasing him. Yet it wasn't only the lyrics, it was the way he carried himself while singing them. Robert didn't perform with the polished charm of a showman. There was no forced smile, no theatrical gestures. He played with an intensity that seemed to turn inward, his head lowered, fingers moving like they were trying to outrun the very words coming out of his mouth. Some regulars at the juke joints swore that when he really got going, the lantern light seemed to lose its strength, like the room dimmed around him. A few insisted that in those moments they couldn't quite make out his face. All they could see clearly were his hands flickering over the strings in the half-light. Others went even further, claiming that his shadow, cast against the wall, didn't keep a steady rhythm with his body. They said it swayed too slow or too fast, almost like it had its own tempo. Despite packed rooms and growing demand, Robert always seemed mentally somewhere else when he played, as if the stage was only a doorway to a place only he could see. People who watched him up close described him as distant, distracted, or tuned to a frequency nobody else could hear. Between songs, he didn't tell long stories or crack jokes. He rarely said much at all. When he did speak, the words were quiet, sometimes cryptic, sometimes little more than a nod or a half-smile that raised more questions than it answered. One woman remembered approaching him after a set, nervously trying to ask how he learned to play like that. According to her, he barely met her eyes when he murmured, "It ain't just me. You just gotta listen close." People did listen. And the more they listened, the more unsettled they became, because underneath the beauty of the melodies, beneath the rasp and tension in his voice, there was a lingering sensation that maybe these songs weren't coming from Robert alone. It felt, to some, like he'd become a channel, a conduit, as if his music had opened a door somewhere, and whatever had stepped through was now sharing the stage with him every night. Yet for all the dark rumors, perhaps the most remarkable thing about his music was what sat at its core. Underneath the ghostly edges and the haunted tone, there was a painfully human center. His songs made people feel recognized, seen. They didn't just inspire fear. They pulled tears from eyes that were used to staying dry. People cried not because they believed a devil was hiding in the chords, but because they felt that someone finally understood their private, wordless pain. His music carried the weight of exhaustion, of loneliness, of wanting something better and never quite reaching it. He gave shape to the feeling of being trapped and still somehow hoping. In those crowded rooms, for a few minutes, listeners felt that someone had lived their sorrow and dared to turn it into sound. Robert's songs did haunt people, but they also healed them. They reminded people that even the broken could create something unforgettable. That even a man who sounded like he was running from shadows could craft melodies that cut straight through the darkness. That's the strange magic still present in every pop and crackle of his old recordings. It's not just a man and a guitar. It is a soul stripped wide open, shaking, burning, revealing things the world had never heard in that way before, and may never hear again. Fun 5. For a man whose music sounded like it leaked in from somewhere beyond this world, it almost seemed inevitable that Robert Johnson's death would be as strange and unsettled as his life. By the time he drifted into Greenwood, Mississippi, he was no longer just another traveling bluesman with a worn guitar and a suitcase of songs. He was a rumor in motion, a name traded from juke joint to juke joint, a shadow that seemed to arrive just after dark and leave before the sun had fully risen. Other singers were already covering his songs. His name carried a certain hush when it was spoken, a mix of respect, fear, and something like superstition. Yet for all that, Robert still moved the way he always had. Never rooted, never resting, never staying anywhere long enough to be safe. Always on the road, always playing. Some said it was hunger ambition that wouldn't let him stop. Others believed he was running from something only he could sense, a presence or a memory that followed him from town to town. One heavy summer night in 1938, he played a small gathering on a plantation just outside Greenwood. The air was thick, humid, the kind of heat that made every breath feel slow and weighted. Music floated over laughter and the clink of bottles. But according to people who claimed to be there, something about that night felt wrong from the beginning. Robert played like a man on fire, pouring more intensity than usual into every song. But beneath the energy, there was a strain in the air, a tension no one could quite name, a quiet conflict humming behind the noise. As he played, his eyes kept returning to a woman in the crowd, the wife of the plantation owner. Their exchange, witnesses said, was almost silent glances, small movements, nothing obvious. But what unsettled people wasn't romance. It was the look on her face. Not excitement, not flirtation, fear. Later that night, the husband appeared. He moved through the crowd with a smile too smooth, holding a glass of whiskey in his hand. He went straight to Robert, still wearing that calm, measured expression. He offered the drink to him directly. Robert took it without hesitation, no questions, no pause. He lifted the glass and drank. A friend later claimed he tried to slap the drink away, sensing something wrong too late. By the time he reacted, the damage was done, the glass was already empty. What followed did not look like a simple drunken stumble. At first, Robert just seemed a little off balance, his steps uneven. He began to sweat heavily, his face tightening in discomfort. Before long, he staggered away from the crowd and slipped into the shadows near the barn, bent over, clutching at his stomach. People laughed it off at first. Another musician who'd had too much to drink. Another bluesman losing the night to bad liquor. But as the hours passed and the party faded, it became harder to dismiss. By morning, whatever was happening could no longer be disguised as a hangover. Robert was in real trouble. The pain did not ease. It twisted and held. He was moved to a small shack behind the main house, out of sight, out of mind. There, over the next few days, he lay on a thin bed or the floor, writhing and groaning. No doctor was summoned. No hospital was called. Friends who stayed with him during those final hours later recalled that he drifted in and out, sometimes muttering, sometimes singing. Fragments of his own songs slipped from his mouth like half-remembered prayers. Snatches of crossroad blues. Lines from Hellhound on My Trail. He kept circling back to one line in particular. You may bury my body down by the highway side. The way he repeated it, weak, insistent, made people wonder if he had always known something about his end, if he'd seen it coming long before that night in Greenwood. Robert Johnson died in that shack at just 27 years old. There was no autopsy, no tidy line on a report to close the case. Official answers never arrived. In the absence of certainty, theories multiplied. Some said he had been poisoned out of jealousy. Revenge slipped into a drink. Others whispered about disease, about syphilis slowly eating away at him after years on the road. And then, of course, there were those who said the bill had finally come due, that whatever he had met at the crossroads had returned to collect what it was owed. His burial only deepened the mystery. No one can say with complete certainty where Robert Johnson's body lies. 3 different graveyards in Mississippi claim to hold him, 3 separate markers, 3 supposed resting places. At one, a proper headstone. At another, a simple marker etched with a guitar. At the third, just earth and the traces of visitors who believed he was there. Flowers are left. Guitar picks are pressed into the dirt. Names and lyrics get scratched into stone. But the question remains, which one, if any, is truly his grave? Wherever his body actually rests, the truth of how he died remains as blurred as the truth of how he changed. What is known is this. When word of Robert Johnson's death began to drift through the South, the wider world barely flinched. There were no headlines splashed across newspapers, no urgent tributes, no national mourning. He was, to most of America at that moment, just another black man who died young in a country that hardly bothered to record such losses. His passing was swallowed by silence. But the ones who had been in those dim rooms with him, the ones who had felt the strange chill of his music, knew that something larger had gone out that day, a light most people never got the chance to see. Over the years, that quiet, nearly unnoticed death began to grow louder than many lives that lasted far longer. The legend thickened, the questions multiplied. Some stories even claimed that, as he lay dying, Robert smiled. That in his final moments, he looked upward, eyes wide, as if he saw someone or something waiting just beyond the edge of the room, and then he was gone. Revenge, illness, bad luck, a dark bargain finally enforced, no one has ever proved a single answer. What remains certain is this. Robert Johnson's death did not silence his music. In a way, it amplified it. Because, even after the body failed, the voice refused to disappear. It still crackles through old records, still spills from lonely speakers on long southern highways, still hides in the background of songs by artists who never met him but carry his influence in their fingers. And if you ever find yourself near Highway 61, with the wind shifting just right and the night stretched thin, some people say you might hear it too, a faint guitar line in the distance. Like someone is still out there, playing for something only he can see. Robert Johnson died at 27 alone, in pain, and largely ignored by the world beyond a few dusty back roads. There was no dramatic farewell, no orchestra, no cameras. Just a shack, a failing body, and a handful of witnesses who didn't yet understand what they were watching slip away. But that number 27 would not stay ordinary for long. At first, there was no talk of a club, no curse, no pattern. Just a young bluesman gone too soon, buried in uncertainty, and left out of the history books. Decades later, though, other names began to disappear at that same age. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Kurt Cobain, talented, troubled artists who burned too bright and faded too fast. Fans, critics, and conspiracy theorists alike started to link the dates, to see a shape where there had once been only isolated tragedies. A pattern, a haunting coincidence, a curse. When people traced the idea back before rock, before psychedelic stages and stadium lights, they found Robert Johnson standing at the edge, the first to fall, the original 7-year-old whose gifts seemed too intense to last, the man whose genius arrived out of nowhere and disappeared before the world had the chance to truly understand it. But for Robert, death was not a closed door. It was the start of something stranger. His music, which had once floated only through smoke-filled bars and small gatherings, almost vanished with him. For years his songs mostly lived in memories and stories. Then, in a warehouse buried in the archives of Columbia Records, someone found a box. Inside, on brittle old shellac discs, were 29 recordings. Songs that had somehow survived time, neglect, and indifference. Scratched, fragile, but still alive. When those records were cleaned up, pressed, and played decades after Robert's death, the sound that came roaring out of the speakers was like a shock wave. Crackling and raw, but unmistakably powerful, his voice cut across the years as if no time had passed at all. It didn't sound quaint or outdated. It sounded urgent, haunted, electric. Critics who had never heard his name before were stunned. Musicians already deep into their own careers suddenly found themselves humbled. Eric Clapton would later say that Robert Johnson was, in his view, the most important blues singer who had ever lived. Keith Richards famously described hearing Robert for the first time and not believing it was only one man. To him, it sounded like two guitars at once, one keeping time, the other weaving patterns too intricate to grasp at first listen. Bob Dylan reportedly sat in silence for hours after hearing those recordings, trying to process the depth and weight inside them. The man who had once been overlooked by almost everyone had somehow returned to teach the world a new way to listen. From there, his influence spread like a hidden current. You can hear echoes of him in the Rolling Stones' Love in Vain, in the bending strings and aching phrasing of Led Zeppelin's guitar work, in the sorrow-soaked ballads of countless artists who tried to give voice to pain they couldn't fully explain. Robert's sound didn't stay locked in the blues. It seeped into rock, soul, folk, and beyond. It became part of the DNA of American music, a ghost line running underneath everything that came after. As his music resurfaced, so did the myth. People revisited the story of the Crossroads, now armed with the knowledge of his age at death. The legend of the 27 Club took on a darker edge. Robert wasn't just an early member. To many, he became the foundation, the blueprint, a gifted young artist who seemed to trade stability for brilliance, who burned through life like a fuse and vanished before the world was ready for him. Fans began making pilgrimages to his supposed graves, even when they weren't entirely sure which one was truly his. They left guitar picks on cool stone, pressed handwritten lyrics into the dirt, murmured lines from his songs into the wind. Some knelt and placed their hands on the ground, as if hoping to feel some faint, lingering rhythm still humming below the surface. In a strange way, Robert Johnson never really left. The music that had almost been lost now plays on turntables, in documentaries, in playlists, in the background of films, and in the fingertips of guitarists who never met him but carry his phrasing anyway. The silence that followed his death has been transformed into a long, echoing note that hasn't stopped ringing. And maybe that's the darkest, deepest truth of his story. Some voices are too strong for the grave. Some songs refuse to end just because the hands that first played them are gone. Robert Johnson may have died young, but in every bend of the blues, in every chord that trembles with something too honest to fake, he's still there, calling from that invisible place between the living and the legend.